I guess I'll read a bit from this book, a few, sort of three main points of view, three main characters, and sort of read a short excerpt from each one, and then we'll talk. And if you guys have questions afterward, we can all have a conversation. If not, I'll go back to the bar, and yeah, I think it'll work out well. So my first novel, American Rust, was about something that was sort of an area that was close to where I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, which is kind of a failed industrial town. And it was about the first generation of kids to grow up as my sort of friends, my childhood friends did, after all the mills and the sort of big industry had shut down and moved to some degree out of the country and to some degree just to a different part of the U.S. It was mostly a textile mill neighborhood I grew up in, though there were big steel mills in Baltimore and shipyards and auto plants as well that had also gone away. And of course, all the kind of secondary industries, machinists, welders, and things like that, and those businesses had also closed. And so this first book was about kind of the sort of end of the American dream for a large portion of the American middle class, and was sort of about the death of the blue-collar middle class in the U.S. For some reason, critics thought this was depressing, and so I thought I would write another book about what I saw as a more hopeful time in U.S. history. Basically, the kind of the opening of the frontier, and we'd follow one sort of typically American family who had come from Europe, who had nothing. They moved to the frontier, which, whether you're talking about the frontier in, say, 1650 in the U.S., which was basically where sort of a line from Boston to New York to Philadelphia down to Baltimore, or you're talking about the frontier 200 years later, which was kind of in the middle of the country, 1,500 miles west of that. The experience on the frontier was basically the same. It was not, I know you guys have seen probably some American movies, but you know, as a kid in the U.S., you grow up with sort of this bombardment of John Wayne. Dances with Wolves comes along later. But there's this mythology that we have of the sort of good whites or the good Europeans moving into this uncharted wilderness. And for some reason, there are some Indians around. We're not sure why exactly what they're doing there. But we know that they're bad and that they attack our ancestors. But the reason people move to the frontier, there's really only one reason. You were poor, you had nothing, or you were wealthy and you had an enormously high risk tolerance and a kind of a will to die. The frontier was a place that was basically a combat zone. Whether it was, again, you're talking sort of 1600s, 1800s, to the close of the frontier in about 1890. It was a place in which you did not want to bring your family. It was like the equivalent of moving to a very, very poor neighborhood in the U.S., or say moving to Baghdad in 2004 or something like this. So this book follows one family from the kind of settlement of the frontier in the 1840s through their rise as a cattle and oil dynasty. And we kind of see, again, this is sort of my take, this like typical powerful American family. The first point of view, the first character we'll hear from is the founder, the kind of patriarch of the family. He's taken captive by the Comanches, which is, again, fairly common. Whether, you know, anytime on the frontier, anytime you have two cultures sort of meeting like this, there's always some degree of interchange, sometimes peaceful, sometimes not. And it was fairly common in the U.S. for whites to be taken captive by Native Americans, and of course, vice versa. In fact, something that we call the captivity narrative was the sort of dominant storytelling mode, the equivalent of a detective fiction today, in the late 1700s and up to the probably mid to late 1800s. So this is stories of, you know, innocent modern Europeans, whites, being stolen by the Indians and being forced to live among them. So this is the patriarch, Eli McCullough. We hear from him sort of at the end of his life. He's reflecting on his family and his life, and he's thinking about how things have changed and how there's no one left like him anymore. This is Colonel Eli McCullough in 1936. It was prophesied I would live to see 100, and having achieved that age, I see no reason to doubt it. I am not dying a Christian, though my scalp is intact, and if there is an eternal hunting ground, that is where I'm headed. There where the river Styx. My opinion at this moment is my life has been far too short, the good I could do if given another year on my feet. Instead, I'm strapped to this bed, fouling myself like an infant. Should the Creator see fit to give me strength, I will make my way to the waters that run through the pasture. The Nueces River at its eastern bend. I've always preferred the Devil's. In my dreams, I've reached the water 3 times, and it is known that Alexander the Great, on his last night of mortal life, crawled from his palace and tried to slip into the Euphrates, knowing that if his body disappeared, his people would assume he had ascended to heaven as a god. His wife stopped him at the water's edge. She dragged him home to die mortal. And people ask why I did not remarry. Should my son appear, I would prefer not to suffer his smile of victory. Seed of my destruction, I know what he did, and I suspect he has long graced the banks of the River Jordan, as Quanah Parker, last chief of the Comanches, gave the boy scant chance to reach 50. In return for this information, I gave to Quanah and his warriors a young bull buffalo, a prime animal to be slain the old way with lances on my pastures that had once been their hunting grounds. One of Quanah's companions was a venerable Arapaho chief, and as we sat partaking of the bull's warm liver in the ancient manner, dipped in the animal's own bile, he gave me a silver ring he had personally removed from the finger of George Armstrong Custer. The ring is marked 7th Cav. It bears a deep scar from a lance, and, having no suitable heir, I will take it to the river with me. Most will be familiar with the date of my birth. The Declaration of Independence that bore the Republic of Texas out of Mexican tyranny was ratified March 2nd, 1836, in a humble shack at the edge of the Brazos. Half the signatories were malarial. The other half had come to Texas to escape a hangman's noose. I was the first male child of this new republic. The Spanish had been in Texas hundreds of years, but nothing had come of it. Since Columbus, they had been conquering all the natives that stood in their way, and while I have never met an Aztec, they must have been a pack of mincing choir boys. The Apaches stopped the old conquistadors in their tracks. Then came the Comanche. The earth had seen nothing like them since the Mongols. They drove the Apaches into the sea, destroyed the Spanish army, and turned Mexico into a slave market. I've seen Comanches herding villagers along the Pecos, hundreds at a time, no different from the way we drove cattle. Having been trounced by the Aboriginals, the Mexican government devised a desperate plan to settle Texas. Any man of any nation willing to move west of the Sabine River would receive 4,000 acres of free land. The fine print was written in blood. The Comanche philosophy toward outsiders was nearly papal in its thoroughness: torture and kill the men, rape and kill the women, take the children for slaves or adoption. And so few from the ancient countries of Europe took the Mexicans up on their offer. In fact, no one came at all. Except the Americans, they flooded in. They had women and children to spare, and to him that overcometh, I giveth to eat of the tree of life. So the next character we hear from, the sort of second point of view in the book, is that guy's great-great-granddaughter. She's born 100 years after him, 90 years later. We're also catching her possibly at the end of her life. And she's the one who's kind of taken the family. There's a big transition in Texas and in the South, contrary to sort of like our own mythology and what's sort of spread to the rest of the U.S. The cattle business was actually never that profitable. It was profitable for maybe 20 years, from about 1866, the end of our Civil War, until about 1886. At that point, it collapsed, much like your guys' tulip bubble, and everyone went bankrupt. And so what you have is all these old families in Texas who'd made their money on cattle, struggling for about 15 years, then 25 years, and then really selling off their land, and their names kind of disappearing. And then oil begins to be discovered in Texas in a few places, mostly in the kind of sort of eastern, Spindletop is kind of East Texas, southern East Texas. And then it's found in a few more places and a few more places. And all of the families who made it and survived and kept their land because they found oil. This is not part of the popular mythology, but in fact, even in Texas, the number one cash crop up until 1930 was cotton. Texas was fundamentally an agricultural state. East Texas is we don't think of this way because the movies don't portray it this way, but sort of half of Texas gets an enormous amount of rainfall, 55 inches, 60 inches. Ecologically, it's sort of comparable to Arkansas, Louisiana. It's a very wet place with pine trees and rolling, sandy hills. Sort of, if you look at it and you sort of were dropped into the middle of it, you think, oh, I'm in the American East Coast. It feels sort of big trees and lush, lots of mosquitoes and things like this. And as you get into West Texas, the part that they put in movies becomes drier and drier and drier, and until finally you're into sort of a high desert, what actually was a kind of a rolling grassland up until about 1900, when they dropped hundreds of thousands of too many head of cattle there, basically ate the grass down to the roots, and destroyed this ecosystem in maybe 10 years that have been kind of growing there since the Ice Age. At any rate, this is the family member who kind of transforms the family from a kind of cattle dynasty, failing cattle empire, into an oil dynasty. It does it basically single-handedly. This is Jean Ann McCullough. It's March 3rd, 2012. There were murmurs and quiet voices, not enough light. She was in a large room that she first mistook for a church or courthouse, and though she was awake, she couldn't feel anything. It was like floating in a warm bath. There were dim chandeliers, logs smoking in the fireplace, Jacobean chairs and tables, and the busts of old Greeks. There was a rug that had been a gift from the Shah. She wondered who would find her. It was a big white house in the Spanish style, 19 bedrooms, a library, a great room, and a ballroom. She and her brothers had all been born here, but now it was nothing more than a weekend house, a place for family reunions. The Mays would not be back until morning. Her mind was perfectly awake, but the rest of her seemed to have been left unplugged, and she was fairly certain that someone was responsible for this condition. She was 86 years old, but even if she loved telling others that she couldn't wait to cross over to the land of Mañana, it was not exactly true. The most important thing is a man who does what I tell him. She had made the mistake of saying this to a reporter from Time magazine, and they'd put her on the cover, 41 and still sultry, standing on her Cadillac in front of a field of pump jacks. She was a small, slender woman, though people forgot this soon after meeting her. Her voice carried, and her eyes were gray, like an old pistol or a blue norther. She was striking, though not exactly beautiful. Which this Yankee photographer must have noticed. He had her open her blouse a few more notches and did her hair like she'd stepped out of an open car. This was not the height of her power. That had come decades later, but it was an important moment. They'd all begun to take her seriously. And now, she thought, the man who took that photograph was dead. No one is going to find you. Of course, it was always going to happen this way. Even as a child, she'd been mostly alone. Her family had owned the town. People made no sense to her. Men with whom she had everything in common did not want her around. women with whom she had nothing in common, smiled too much, laughed too loud, and mostly reminded her of small dogs, their lives lost in interior decorating and other people's outfits. There had never been a place for a person like her. So the third point of view in the book is the son of Eli McCullough, who's kind of the opposite of his father. He grows up in a kind of a different time as the frontier is closing. He's the only member of the family who has he has a sort of a strong moral compass. He doesn't adjust his sort of view of Earth and his view of what's right based on what he wants from the world. We catch him in 1915, which is sort of World War II has begun. And in the southern border of the U.S., Mexico is sort of aligned itself with Germany. There's this famous thing called the Zimmerman telegram in which Germany promises, in quotes, to send Mexico however many German troops they needed if Mexico would just get off its ass and invade the U.S. This kind of inspired a lot of Americans to feel fairly hostilely toward Mexico, which is, of course, in the middle of its own kind of second revolution at this point. And the periods of 1915 to 1918, at least in southern Texas, marked the beginning of a series of massacres of Mexican Americans. No one's exactly sure because the land there, you'd have 1 million acres with no roads, one road, another 1 million acres, no roads, another road, another 1 million acres. So, human life didn't mean so much, and it was easy to lose a body, wherever you had to. And the end of this period, 1918, the Texas Rangers are dissolved, basically. And this is a sort of the proudest sort of military, paramilitary force in Texas. They're still sort of talked about today. But basically the sort of like massacres of Mexicans, as they were called, but they were actually mostly American citizens, were so bad that even the Rangers sort of like had to be held accountable. They're brought back in mid-1930s, and Chuck Norris then theoretically became a part of them in this TV show. But I sort of learned about this period when I was living in Texas in this history class, and so there's a large period of massacring going on. How come this hasn't been talked about? And the guy who was teaching the class said, someone should mention this at some point, and sort of that was the point I sort of knew that I would write about it, I guess. So this is Peter McCullough. This is sort of the beginning of that fairly violent period. And this is certainly, the violence was for both. It was, quite multi-directional. Many of the Anglo ranches were attacked fairly regularly. Trains were blown up. Telegraph lines were blown up. Telephone lines couldn't be kept open. And there was targeted killings on both sides. This is August 10th, 1915. My birthday. Today, without the help of any whiskey, I've reached the conclusion I am no one. Looking back on my 45 years, I see nothing worthwhile. What I had mistaken for a soul appears more like a black abyss. I've allowed others to shape me as they pleased. To ask the colonel, I'm the worst son he has ever had. He's always preferred Phineas, and even poor dead Everett. This journal will be the only true record of our family. In Austin, they're planning a celebration for the colonel's 80th birthday, but what can honestly be said about a man who is lionized in capitals, I don't know. Meanwhile, our bloody summer continues. The telephone lines to Brownsville cannot be kept open. Every time they are repaired, the insurgents blow them up. The King Ranch was attacked by 40 gunmen last night. There was a 3-hour gun battle at Los Tolitos, and the president of the Cameron Law and Order League was shot to death, though whether the latter is a gain or loss, I can't say. As for the Mexicans, to see the number of them shot in bar ditches or hung from trees, you would think them as ill a scourge as the panther or the wolf. The San Antonio Express no longer mentions their deaths. It would take up too much paper. And so the Tejano die unrecorded and are buried, if at all, in shallow graves or roped and dragged off where they will not bother anyone. After Longino and Esteban Morales were killed last month, by whom we don't know, though I suspect our neighbor, Niles Gilbert, the colonel devised a note for all our vaqueros. This man is a good Mexican. Please leave him alone. When I am done with him, I will kill him myself. Our men display these notes like badges of honor. They worship the colonel along with everyone else. Unfortunately for the Tejano, the area cattlemen continue to lose stock. In the west pasture last week, Sullivan and I found a section where the wire had been cut, and by nightfall we found only 263 cows and calves versus the 478 counted during the spring roundup. A $20,000 loss, and all evidence, circumstantially at least, pointing to our neighbors, the Garcias. I myself would rather lose the kingdom than lay blood libel against the wrong person, but that, around here, is a rare sentiment. I've always thought I ought to have been born in the old states where, though their soil is even more blood-soaked than ours, they no longer need their guns. Even Austin I find overwhelming, as if each of its 60,000 inhabitants were shouting at me at once. I've always found it difficult to clear my head. Images and sounds linger with me for years, and so here I remain in the one place that is truly mine, whether it wants me or not. As we examined the cut fences, Sullivan pointed out, quite unnecessarily, that the tracks led right into the Garcia lands, which border the river, which, as it has been so dry, can be crossed nearly anywhere. I do not mind old Pedro, he said, but his son-in-laws are as vile a pack of niggers as I have ever seen. You've been spending too much time with the colonel, I told him. He does sabe his Mexicans. Well, I have found just the opposite. In that case, boss, I'm hoping you will learn me the various honest explanations for a cut fence leading to Pedro Garcia's pastures while we are short 200 head. Time was we would cross and take them back, but that is a bit above our bend these days. Old Pedro, I said, can't watch every inch of his land any more than we can watch every inch of ours. You're a big man, said Sullivan, and I don't see why you act like such a small one.